The first sign was the iridescent sheen, a grotesque rainbow bleeding across the surface of what had always been my sanctuary, my family's legacy, Heron Lake. They called it a retention pond in their meticulously manicured HOA documents, a sterile term for a living body of water that had thrummed with life long before their cookie-cutter houses and asphalt arteries scarred the landscape. They didn't know. They didn't know its depths fed the aquifer from which their own taps drew water. They didn't know that the old wellhead, disguised by a quaint, dilapidated pump house on my property, was the original source, grandfathered in, its rights sacrosanct, its output still technically part of the local municipal draw in emergencies. They saw a convenient dumping ground. I saw a declaration of war. The official notice slipped under my door with the casual malice only a homeowners association president like Mildred Carmichael could muster, cited necessary landscaping adjustments on common property bordering the lake. Necessary. The word choice was as offensive as the act itself. My daughter Lily found the first casualties. 3 bloated sunfish, their silver scales dull, eyes milky, washed up near the reeds where she'd learned to skip stones. Her small hand clutched mine, her voice a whisper, "Daddy, what's wrong with the water?" That was the moment the switch flipped. The quiet life I'd cultivated, the deliberate retreat from a past life that dealt in consequences and hard lines, evaporated like morning mist under a harsh sun. Mildred, with her permed helmet of hair and her Napoleonic complex fueled by monthly dues, had been a persistent, low-grade irritant for years. Fines for grass a quarter-inch too long. Citations for the unapproved shade of our porch swing. Petty tyrannies. This, however, was not petty. This was a violation that resonated deep in the bedrock of my being, an attack on my home, my child's innocence, and, though they were blissfully, criminally ignorant of it, their own damn survival. They thought they were just making their construction debris problem disappear. They had no idea they were poisoning themselves, and in doing so, had handed me the very weapon I needed to dismantle their reign. My blood ran cold, not with fear, but with a chilling, precise clarity. They had crossed a line etched not in their bylaws, but in the earth itself. And they would pay, not in fines, not in apologies. They would pay in exposure, in ruin, and in the agonizing realization of their own monumental stupidity. The water samples I took that evening, under the cloak of a moonless night, told a story of chemical betrayal, solvents, paint residues, concrete leachate. The lab I still had connections with, a relic from that past life, fast-tracked the results. Confirmed. Highly toxic. Actionable. Mildred's landscaping adjustments were in fact the illegal dumping of construction waste from the new community clubhouse, a monument to her ego being built with suspiciously low bids. The arrogance was breathtaking. The lake, my lake, was now a crime scene. And I, the reluctant warrior they mistook for a quiet recluse, was about to become its avenging angel, armed not with a sword, but with the irrefutable, damning truth. They had opened Pandora's box. They just didn't realize I was the one who held the key. The initial wave of fury, that raw protective instinct that had surged when Lily found those dead fish, began to cool, congealing into something far more dangerous: purpose. My workshop, usually a place of quiet tinkering, transformed into a tactical operations center. The old topographical maps of the valley were spread across the workbench, original survey lines highlighted, aquifer flows marked in blue. This wasn't just my lake, it was the heart of a delicate ecosystem, and, as I already knew with chilling certainty, the primary recharge zone for the Wellfield 7, the one the Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association relied upon. Mildred Carmichael, in her infinite wisdom, had authorized the poisoning of her own constituents. The irony would have been delicious if the stakes weren't so high. My first call was to Arthur Jenkins, a retired EPA field investigator, who'd seen more environmental crimes than most people had hot dinners. We'd been through the ringer together on a Superfund site case back east, a lifetime ago. "Arthur," I said, the connection crackling slightly. I've got a situation. Local HOA. Illegal dumping carcinogens into a primary water source. There was a pause. Then Arthur's gravelly voice. And they don't know it's their water source, do they, Marcus? He knew me too well. Bingo, I replied. They think it's just my pond. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Amateurs, send me the data. I'll tell you who to call at the state level. Someone who owes me a favor and isn't afraid to bring the hammer down on suburban royalty. While Arthur worked his magic, I turned my attention to the HOA itself. Their bylaws, their meeting minutes, their financial statements, all public record, yet rarely scrutinized by the placid residents of Creekwood Estates. My sidekick in this burgeoning operation was unexpected. Mrs. Henderson from 2 streets over, a woman whose prize-winning roses had once been the subject of a 3-month HOA disciplinary hearing initiated by Mildred over non-native species. She was a veritable encyclopedia of neighborhood grievances and possessed a surprisingly sharp mind for bureaucratic loopholes, hidden beneath a veneer of sweet grandmotherliness. She also had a nephew, Kevin, a pasty, caffeine-fueled computer science student who treated hacking into poorly secured municipal databases as a recreational sport. Mildred's been funneling funds, Marcus. Mrs. Henderson whispered conspiratorially over lukewarm tea, handing me a printout Kevin had procured showing inflated invoices from Carmichael Contracting, the company that won the clubhouse bid, coincidentally owned by Mildred's brother-in-law. Conflict of interest doesn't even begin to cover it. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't just negligence, it was greed, arrogance, and a level of corruption that thrived in the apathy of the suburbs. The petty harassment, the fines, the power trips, they were symptoms of a deeper rot. The dumping in my lake was merely the most blatant, most destructive manifestation. My family was the immediate trigger, Lily's small, worried face, the constant image in my mind. But this was bigger now. This was about a community being slowly poisoned, both literally and figuratively, by a woman who saw them not as neighbors, but as subjects. The initial shock had passed. Now, it was time for the methodical, surgical dismantling. Step 1, irrefutable evidence. Step 2, allies in high places. Step 3, exposing the rot from within. Mildred Carmichael was about to learn that some quiet men harbor very loud pasts, and that a father's protective instinct, when weaponized by intellect and experience, is a force of nature. Her carefully constructed kingdom, built on petty rules and pilfered funds, was about to be washed away by a tide of her own making. The official letter from the State Department of Environmental Quality, hand-delivered by a grim-faced courier, landed on Mildred Carmichael's faux Tuscan doorstep like a judgment. I watched from my window, a thermal mug of coffee warming my hands, the rising sun glinting off the now cordoned-off section of the lake. Yellow tape, stark and official, screamed a silent accusation. The courier didn't just deliver it to Mildred. Copies, I knew, were simultaneously arriving at every board member's address, and, most deliciously, at the county health department and the municipal water authority. Arthur had come through. The letter, drafted with the ruthless precision only a seasoned environmental lawyer could achieve, detailed the chemical analysis of the water samples, cited specific violations of state and federal environmental protection acts, and mandated an immediate cessation of all activity near the lake. It also, and this was the masterstroke, formally requested all hydrological data pertaining to Wellfield 7, citing potential contamination of a public water supply. The subtle shift from your pond to public water supply was a semantic bomb. I could almost hear the gears grinding in Mildred's head, the dawning horror as she connected dots she hadn't even known existed. Her reign was built on ignorance, hers and her constituents. That ignorance was now her enemy. The Creekwood Estates online forum, usually a sleepy repository of complaints about dog poop and noisy teenagers, exploded. Panic, righteous anger, and a healthy dose of "I told you so" from a few brave souls who'd tangled with Mildred before and lost. My phone started ringing. Neighbors. Tentative at first. then more insistent. Is it true, Marcus? Is that pond our water? The pond they'd so casually dismissed, the one Mildred had treated as her personal landfill, was suddenly a matter of life and death. The supporting cast, the silent majority, was stirring. They were no longer just passive observers of Mildred's tyranny. They were potential victims of her malfeasance. My family, my emotional anchor, became their symbol. Lily, usually shy, had drawn a picture of a sad fish with a tear in its eye, which Mrs. Henderson, bless her subversive heart, had photocopied and surreptitiously distributed. It became the unofficial logo of the burgeoning rebellion. The sidekick, Kevin, had meanwhile unearthed a treasure trove from the HOA's poorly secured cloud server. Emails between Mildred and her brother-in-law discussing cost-effective waste disposal and keeping the EPA busybodies off our backs. He'd also found the original geological surveys for Creekwood Estates, clearly marking the lake as a critical recharge area for the aquifer. Documents Mildred had either never bothered to read or had willfully ignored. The beauty of it was that I hadn't had to resort to threats or overt aggression. The truth, meticulously gathered and strategically deployed, was doing the work for me. My hidden authority wasn't just my past. It was my understanding of systems, of cause and effect, of how to turn an opponent's own weight against them. Mildred had built her power on a foundation of sand, and the tide was now coming in. The next HOA meeting was scheduled in 3 days. It was originally intended to be a victory lap for Mildred, a celebration of the new clubhouse's progress. Now, it was shaping up to be her public execution. The deadpan sarcasm I'd cultivated over years of dealing with bureaucratic nonsense was barely contained. "They're about to get a real education in hydrogeology," I murmured to myself, watching a news van pull up outside Mildred's house. The media had caught the scent of blood in the water, quite literally. The tactical retaliation was entering its next phase. The groundwork of evidence and official notification was laid. Now came the application of pressure, relentless and precise. My inner monologue became a checklist, each item ticked off with cold satisfaction. Water test results, submitted and acknowledged. Official complaints, filed with every relevant agency from local to state. Legal counsel. Arthur Jenkins was now officially on retainer, his name alone carrying weight in environmental law circles. He'd already drafted a preliminary injunction to halt all construction activities associated with the clubhouse, citing improper waste disposal and endangerment, a document ready to be filed the moment the HOA board tried to stonewall. The beauty of their own bylaws, those weapons Mildred had so gleefully wielded against residents for trivial infractions, was that they also stipulated transparency and fiduciary duty. Kevin, Mrs. Henderson's nephew, had become an invaluable asset, a digital ghost in their machine. He'd set up an anonymous tip line, and disillusioned residents, emboldened by the official DEQ notice, began to feed him information. Stories of Mildred overriding safety concerns on other projects, of funds being reallocated without votes, of bullying tactics used to silence dissent. Each piece of information was a small nail in her coffin. The local news picked up the story with predictable alacrity. Paradise poisoned? HOA under fire for contaminating own water supply. The headline was sensational, but accurate. My porch became an impromptu press briefing location, though I remained carefully in the background, letting the documents and the growing chorus of concerned neighbors speak for themselves. My role was that of the quiet catalyst, the one who had simply pointed out the emperor had no clothes, and was in fact actively soiling the imperial well. The law enforcement ally materialized in the form of Deputy Chief Miller from the county sheriff's office, a man I knew from my brief stint volunteering with the search and rescue team. He was initially skeptical, HOA disputes usually being beneath his pay grade. But when I laid out the chain of evidence, the lab reports, the DEQ letter, the potential for widespread public health impact, and crucially, the clear paper trail leading back to Mildred's directives regarding the construction waste, his demeanor shifted. "This isn't just an HOA squabble, Marcus," he said, his face grim. If these allegations of deliberate contamination of a public water source are proven, we're looking at felony charges. He wasn't just a reluctant authority figure anymore. He was an investigator with a serious case on his hands. The moral cost of inaction was now squarely on the county's shoulders. My family, particularly Lily, became the human face of the crisis for the media. Her simple drawing of the crying fish was everywhere. It was a powerful, emotionally charged symbol that cut through the bureaucratic jargon. She didn't understand the legal complexities, but she understood that her lake was sick, and the people responsible needed to be stopped. Her innocent conviction fueled my own. The moral violation was absolute, and my response would be equally so. The upcoming HOA meeting was no longer just a meeting. It was a tribunal. The accused, Mildred Carmichael, and her compliant board. The evidence, overwhelming. The jury, the very people they had endangered. The deadpan sarcasm I had cultivated was now a finely honed weapon. When a flustered HOA board member called me, pleading for a private chat to clear up this misunderstanding, my reply was terse. The only misunderstanding, Mr. Henderson, is your belief that this can be resolved privately. The damage is public. The reckoning will be public. The line went silent. They were beginning to understand. They had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness. They were about to learn the difference. The air in the Creekwood Estates Community Hall was thick with a tension you could taste, a metallic tang, like the contaminated water itself. Every seat was filled, residents standing along the walls, their faces a mixture of anger, fear, and grim anticipation. This wasn't your typical HOA meeting about paint swatches and lawn maintenance. This was a reckoning. Mildred Carmichael sat at the head table, flanked by her visibly shaken board members. Her usual imperious demeanor was fractured, replaced by a brittle defensiveness. Her permed hair seemed less a helmet of authority and more a crumbling defense. She tried to open with procedural nonsense, a desperate attempt to control the narrative, but the crowd wasn't having it. "What about the water, Mildred?" A voice boomed from the back. Then, another, and another. A wave of questions, accusations, demands for answers. The silent majority had found its voice. I stood near the back, a silent observer, though all eyes occasionally flickered towards me. I had provided the ammunition. The community was now firing the shots. Mrs. Henderson, no longer just a sweet old lady with a rose grievance, rose to her feet, a sheaf of papers in her hand. Kevin, her nephew, stood beside her, looking like a deer in headlights but holding a laptop connected to the projector. "Madam President," Mrs. Henderson began, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the din. "We have some questions regarding the clubhouse construction contract and certain financial discrepancies." On the screen behind Mildred, Kevin projected the first document, an inflated invoice from Carmichael Contracting, next to a standard quote for similar work from a reputable local firm. Gasps rippled through the room. Then came the emails between Mildred and her brother-in-law, discussing creative accounting for the disposal of excess materials. The color drained from Mildred's face. She banged her gavel, a pathetic, tinny sound against the roar of outrage. "This is out of order. These documents are inadmissible." But it was too late. The dam of her deceit had broken. Then Dr. Evans, a retired physician from down the street, stood up. He spoke calmly, but his words carried immense weight. He detailed the potential health effects of the chemicals found in the lake: liver damage, neurological issues, increased cancer risk. He spoke of the children who played near that water, the pets that drank from it, the gardens irrigated with it before the news broke. He looked directly at Mildred. "You didn't just dump waste, Madam President. You gambled with the health of every single person in this community." That was when Deputy Chief Miller, who had been standing quietly at the entrance, stepped forward. He wasn't in uniform, but his presence was unmistakable. "Mildred Carmichael," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hushed room. "Based on evidence provided to the county sheriff's office and the state DEQ concerning the illegal disposal of hazardous materials and potential endangerment of the public water supply, I have a warrant for your arrest." The collective gasp was a physical force. Mildred stared, mouth agape, as Miller approached the table. The cuffs clicked shut with a sound that was both final and deeply satisfying. It was a public humiliation of epic proportions, broadcast live on the local news station's website, their van parked prominently outside. The kingpin of Creekwood Estates, dethroned not by a coup, but by her own colossal criminal arrogance. The visual metaphor was stark. The locked gate of the police cruiser door closing on Mildred's snarling face, a psychological closure for the entire community. The fight for the lake's health was far from over, but the architect of its poisoning was now facing justice. The other board members looked like terrified rabbits, scrambling to distance themselves, offering resignations, promising full cooperation. Their reign of petty tyranny, propped up by Mildred's iron fist, had crumbled in a single evening. The immediate aftermath of Mildred Carmichael's arrest was a maelstrom of activity, a chaotic ballet of recrimination, relief, and the dawning reality of the cleanup ahead. The other board members, stripped of their figurehead, resembled startled deer, their authority evaporating like the toxic sheen on the lake under a hot sun. Resignations piled up faster than violation notices ever had. The HOA, as it existed, was effectively decapitated, its power structure shattered by the public reckoning. My role shifted subtly. I was no longer just the instigator of justice, the reluctant warrior. I became by default a point person for information, a reluctant leader in the vacuum. My quiet property, once a sanctuary from the world, became a hub for neighbors seeking answers, offering help, or simply needing to vent their fury and fear. Lily, my daughter, became an unlikely hero. Her drawing of the crying fish was now a symbol of unity, plastered on mailboxes and car windows. She didn't fully grasp the legalities, but she understood that bad lady who hurt the lake was gone, and that her daddy had something to do with it. Her quiet pride was a balm to the exhaustion that was beginning to set in. The tactical ops metaphor for my legal strategy had played out almost perfectly. The surprise reversal, that they hadn't known the lake was their water supply, and they certainly hadn't known who I was or what I was capable of, had been the fulcrum upon which their downfall pivoted. The local corruption ties, exposed through Kevin's digital spelunking and Mrs. Henderson's meticulous record-keeping, had added fuel to the fire, ensuring that Mildred wouldn't be the only one facing scrutiny. Carmichael Contracting was now under investigation for fraud and environmental violations. The state DEQ, galvanized by Arthur Jenkins' legal pressure and the undeniable evidence, moved with uncharacteristic speed. Heavy equipment, not for dumping, but for remediation, began to arrive. Specialized crews in hazmat suits started the painstaking process of dredging the contaminated sediment, of testing and retesting the water. It would be a long, expensive process, the cost of which would ultimately fall upon the now defunct HOA's insurance, and likely, through civil suits, upon Mildred herself. The fence around the affected part of my property, once a symbol of the HOA's encroachment and my defiance, now served as a boundary for the cleanup efforts. The visual cue was potent: containment, then healing. The porch light, which Mildred had once cited me for being the wrong wattage, now burned brightly, a small beacon of normalcy returning. The community, however, was forever changed. The apathy was gone, replaced by a vigilant, if wary, engagement. They were forming interim committees, discussing new bylaws, determined never again to cede so much power to one individual. The silent majority had become rebellion fodder, and now they were the architects of their own new governance. The locked gate of the police car was more than just physical confinement for Mildred. It was psychological closure for us all. It represented the end of an era of petty tyranny and the beginning of accountability. There was a somber resilience in the air, a protective loyalty not just to individual properties, but to the shared environment and the well-being of the community. My intensely personal fight had become a collective victory. The moral cost of Mildred's actions was still being tallied in potential health impacts and the literal price of remediation. But the moral authority, wrested from her grasp, now resided with the people she had so callously endangered. The journey from petty harassment to public reckoning had been a relentless escalation, each step taken with surgical precision, fueled by a cold-blooded calm that masked the explosive emotional undercurrents. My family, the emotional anchor, was safe. The lake, our shared legacy, was on the slow path to recovery. The dramatic lighting change wasn't just metaphorical. The hazmat crews often worked under harsh floodlights at night, a constant reminder of the violation and the ongoing battle to undo it. On-screen text, in the form of news headlines and DEQ updates, kept the community informed, a stark contrast to the opaque missives Mildred used to issue. Lake remediation underway. Former HOA president faces multiple felony charges. Community rebuilds trust. Each headline was a small victory, a testament to the power of truth. The supporting characters had played their roles to perfection. Mrs. Henderson, the once timid rose enthusiast, was now chairing the interim oversight committee, her quiet determination a formidable force. Kevin, the tech-savvy sidekick, was designing a new transparent online portal for community governance, ensuring no more secrets could fester. Deputy Chief Miller, the reluctant authority figure turned ally, ensured the legal process moved forward without political interference. Even the broader neighborhood, the silent majority turned rebellion fodder, had stepped up, organizing volunteer groups for shoreline cleanup once the professionals deemed it safe, planting native species to help restore the ecological balance. My monologue-heavy internal commentary had served its purpose, allowing me to process, plan, and execute with tactical clarity. Now, the dialogue was shifting outwards, towards collaborative solutions and shared responsibility. The terse, cold, tactical language I'd employed when confronting the old guard was softening, replaced by a more hopeful, constructive tone when discussing the future with my neighbors. The deadpan sarcasm, however, remained a useful tool for deflating any lingering vestiges of bureaucratic absurdity. The symbolic revenge, tied so deeply to my family's connection with the lake, had been achieved not through vengeance, but through justice. The water itself, the source of life they had defiled, became the instrument of their undoing. The surprise reversal, the protagonist, me, planning all along, leveraging knowledge they didn't possess, was complete. They didn't know I was a hydrologist who had consulted on watershed management for 2 decades. They didn't know I understood the intricate dance of water rights, environmental law, and bureaucratic inertia. They saw a quiet neighbor, easily cowed. They were catastrophically wrong. The military or legal jargon I'd once used daily in a former life had found a new, deeply personal application in this suburban war zone. The first-person retaliation opera had reached its crescendo with Mildred's arrest, and now, the denouement was about restoring harmony. The slow-burning moral authority I had cultivated, not through pronouncements but through meticulous action, was now a recognized force in the community. They trusted me, not because I sought power, but because I had used my knowledge to protect them, even when they hadn't known they were in danger. The final visual metaphor was taking shape, the gradual return of clarity to the lake water, mirroring the newfound clarity in the community's purpose. The intense personal investment in this fight had, for a time, consumed me. Every legal filing, every carefully leaked document, every strategic phone call was a step in a meticulously planned campaign. The tone had been, by necessity, legally lethal and morally unflinching. The initial shock of seeing that oily poison spread across Heron Lake, my lake, their water, had galvanized a part of me, I thought, long dormant. It was a visceral, paternal rage, a protective loyalty to my daughter and to the sanctity of our home. The drone surveillance I'd borrowed from a friend in the early days, capturing irrefutable footage of the midnight dumping, felt like a lifetime ago. Those images, combined with the damning chemical analyses, had formed the bedrock of the case. The zoom-ins on those documents, the violation notices, the damning emails, these were the weapons in this particular war. The antagonist, Mildred, was a caricature of control, a narcissistic delusionist whose downfall was as spectacular as her reign was petty. Her exaggerated sense of power made her blind to the real power of interconnectedness, of the simple fact that poisoning your neighbor often means poisoning yourself. The narrative structure, that linear escalation from her initial absurd demands about lawn height to the catastrophic moral violation of polluting our shared water, had been a classic hero's journey in reverse for her, a villain's descent into self-made oblivion. For me, it was a reluctant warrior's ascent, forced by circumstance. The dark situational irony was never lost on me. The HOA, an entity ostensibly created to protect property values and community standards, had become the single greatest threat to both. My deadpan wit, often expressed in terse, cold dialogue, during confrontations or in my own strategic inner commentary, had been my shield and sometimes my scalpel. So, the beautification project involves hazardous waste, Mildred? Bold aesthetic choice, I'd thought, but never said aloud until the evidence was unshakable. The power paragraphs of legal citations and environmental impact reports had provided the momentum, while the short, declarative sentences in my communications with the HOA conveyed absolute control and zero room for negotiation. The climactic confrontation in that community hall, the public embarrassment of Mildred as the cuffs closed around her wrists, wasn't just about her. It was about reclaiming the narrative, about empowering a community that had been cowed into silence. The visual metaphor of the fence, initially a symbol of boundary disputes, became a line of demarcation between the polluted past and the hopeful future. The porch light, no longer a point of contention, became a small, steady beacon of restored order. The blood, thankfully, had been metaphorical, the death of the ecosystem, the sickness of the water, but the moral cost of inaction would have been far greater. My first-person narration, feeling omniscient, due to the meticulous planning and surveillance, was simply the chronicle of a father and a citizen pushed too far. The military mind versus HOA tyranny dynamic had been an uneven match from the start. They just hadn't realized it. They saw a resident. I saw a target array that needed to be neutralized through legal and informational warfare. The rhythm of life in Creekwood Estates began to find a new, healthier cadence. The relentless pacing of the crisis, those bursts of legal action and moral revelation, gave way to the slower, more deliberate work of healing, both the lake and the community. The on-screen text of arrest warrants and damning headlines was replaced by notices for town hall meetings on water quality, volunteer sign-up sheets for replanting native wetland grasses, and draft proposals for a new, more accountable HOA charter. My inner monologue, once a torrent of tactical calculations and righteous fury, quieted. The fight was won. Now began the vigilance of maintaining the peace. The emotional tone shifted from cold, calculated vengeance to a somber resilience. There was no elation in Mildred's downfall, only a grim satisfaction that justice, however delayed, had been served. The protective loyalty I felt for my family had expanded, encompassing the entire, flawed but ultimately redeemable community. The language style, once precise and weaponized, softened. There was still a place for military or legal jargon when explaining complex environmental reports to the newly formed Water Quality Committee, but it was now used to educate, not to intimidate. The cathartic moments were no longer explosive confrontations but quiet observations. Lily, laughing as she spotted a turtle sunning itself on a log in a cleaner part of the lake. Mrs. Henderson, her roses thriving, confidently chairing a meeting. Kevin, proudly demonstrating the new transparent HOA website. These were the true victories. The shocking opening act of injustice, the pollution, had indeed served as a powerful hook, drawing everyone into a drama they hadn't chosen. The status reveal twist, they didn't know it was their water supply. And implicitly, they didn't know who I was, had been the narrative's engine. Now, the story was about rebuilding. The supporting family, my wife and daughter, were my constant reminders of what was truly at stake. The neighbors, once silent, were now active participants, their voices strong. Even the new interim town manager, a sensible woman who replaced the one implicated in Mildred's network, acted as a legitimate authority figure, keen on restoring public trust. The dialogues were no longer about setting traps, but about finding common ground. The power dynamics had irrevocably shifted. The humor, that dark situational irony, still found its place. The idea that a meticulously planned suburban enclave could so easily poison itself was a tragic comedy of modern life. The juxtaposition of HOA absurdity against the very real threat of ecological disaster remained a potent reminder of what happens when petty power goes unchecked. The sentences were still often declarative, conveying a sense of hard-won certainty, but the power paragraphs were now filled with plans for the future, not recitations of past grievances. The rhetorical flourishes were saved for moments of shared hope, not for punctuating justice against a vanquished foe. The point of view, still first person, felt less omniscient and more like a weary but hopeful chronicler. The taste of victory was not sweet, but it was clean, like the first clear water drawn from a newly purified well. The final act was one of meticulous restoration. The lake, my Heron Lake, was breathing again. The construction waste, tons of it, had been painstakingly removed under the watchful eyes of the DEQ and a committee of concerned residents. The blood of the ecosystem, the dead fish, the contaminated sediment, was being cleansed. The psychological closure for the community was palpable. The locked gate of Mildred's former reign was firmly shut, replaced by open forums and transparent governance. The narrative arc, from petty harassment to moral violation, then tactical retaliation to public reckoning, had reached its conclusion, but the epilogue was still being written by the residents themselves. My role as the reluctant warrior had faded. I was once again Marcus, the quiet neighbor, albeit one with a slightly formidable reputation. The hidden authority, my expertise in hydrology and environmental law, was no longer hidden but a community resource willingly offered. The "they didn't know I was" had transformed into "we're glad you were." The family legacy, the lake, was secured not just by legal deeds, but by the renewed commitment of an entire neighborhood to protect it. Lily now sketched pictures of healthy fish, of children playing by clean water. Her art, once a symbol of loss, became a vision of hope. The supporting cast continued to shine. Mrs. Prober. Henderson, with her strategic mind and encyclopedic knowledge of bylaws, became the first president of the new, reformed HOA, elected by an overwhelming majority. Kevin, the tech-savvy sidekick, ensured their digital operations were Fort Knox secure and completely transparent. Deputy Chief Miller occasionally stopped by, not for official business, but for a cup of coffee and an update on the lake's recovery, a quiet acknowledgement of a job well done. The dark situational irony hadn't entirely vanished. The idea that a community could be brought to the brink by such mundane evil was still a sobering thought, but it was now tempered with the knowledge that even entrenched apathy could be overcome. The dry, deadpan wit was still there, mostly for my own amusement as I observed the sometimes fumbling efforts of the new committees. Democracy, I'd murmur to my wife, is a messy, beautiful thing, especially when it replaces a dictatorship of decorum. The slow zooms in my mind's eye were no longer on incriminating documents, but on the returning wildlife. A blue heron patiently stalking the shallows. A family of ducks gliding across the increasingly clear water. The smash cuts between escalations were replaced by the gentle rhythm of seasonal change on the lake. The visual metaphors had come full circle. The fence was now just a fence, the porch light, a welcoming beacon, the water, a symbol not of peril, but of life renewed. The coldly calculated vengeance had given way to a quiet, enduring satisfaction. Righteous fury had been channeled into constructive action. The intense personal stake had yielded a collective benefit. The legal revenge thriller had become a story of community resilience. They had crossed the line, and in doing so, had inadvertently pushed us all towards a better, more vigilant, more connected way of living. The final bill for Mildred's folly, both financial and ecological, would be paid for years to come. but the ultimate price she paid was the irretrievable loss of power and reputation. And Heron Lake, their water supply, my sanctuary, was finally, truly safe.